When we imagine the Middle Ages, our minds often drift to romantic visions. Noble knights in shining armor, ladies in silken gowns, castles standing tall against the sky, their banners snapping in the wind. Feasts lit by torchlight, with golden goblets brimming with wine. A world of honor, chivalry, and grandeur. But the truth? The truth was far darker and far filthier. Behind the myth, everyday medieval life was defined not by glory, but by misery. For the vast majority of people, survival was a daily battle. Hunger, disease, backbreaking labor, and death waiting just around the corner. Forget the shining armor. Forget the fairy tale castles. This is the Middle Ages stripped bare, a time when the stench of open sewers filled the air, when entire families huddled together in smoke-filled huts, and when a simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. In the medieval world, life was short, brutal, and fragile. Historians estimate that the average life expectancy in medieval Europe was just 30 to 35 years. Half of all children never lived past the age of 5. Mothers routinely died in childbirth, and outbreaks of plague, famine, or war could wipe out entire communities overnight. It was a world without clean water, without medicine as we know it, without the protections we take for granted. A world where fate seemed cruel and survival often felt like a miracle. So tonight we leave behind the fairy tales and confront the truth. We step into the muddy fields, the crowded streets, the cold stone walls of a medieval village. We will see what people ate, how they worked, where they slept. We will smell the stench of disease and hear the cries of suffering. And in doing so, we will discover a truth more haunting than any legend. The miserable truth about medieval life. Daily life of peasants picture. A medieval village at dawn. The sky is gray, the air damp. Mud squelches underfoot. Chickens scratch in the dirt. Smoke seeps lazily from thatched roofs. This is where most people in the Middle Ages lived. Not in castles, not in cities, but in small villages, clusters of huts surrounded by fields. Here lived the peasants, farmers, laborers, serfs, the backbone of medieval society. And yet the ones who suffered the most. Their lives were not their own. Most were tied to the land, bound by feudal obligation. They worked the fields of their lord, giving a portion of their crops as rent. They could not freely leave, marry, or even sell their own produce without permission. They were, in all but name, property. Huts of smoke and straw step inside a peasant's home. Forget comfort. Forget privacy. A typical hut was no more than a single room, its walls made of wattle and daub, its roof thatched with straw. The floor was packed dirt, often damp, often crawling with fleas. In the center stood a small fire, the only source of warmth and light. But there was no chimney. Smoke gathered inside, clinging to the air, stinging the eyes, coating the lungs. Children grew up coughing. Old people wheezed with chronic illness. At night, the entire family, parents, children, even animals, huddled together on straw mats. Pigs and chickens often slept indoors, not out of affection, but necessity. Their body heat offered warmth during the cold months. Their presence brought lice, fleas, and filth. This was not a place of rest. It was survival. The medieval peasant's diet was not a feast of roasted meats and spiced wines. As the nobility enjoyed, it was monotonous, it was meager, and it was fragile. Bread made from rye or barley was the staple. Dark, heavy, often riddled with grit from the millstones that ground the grain. Eating it wore down teeth to the root. Alongside bread came pottage, a watery stew of beans, peas, or turnips, occasionally flavored with onions, cabbage, or a scrap of fat. Meat, rare. Eggs, precious. Milk, often soured before it could be consumed. For protein, Peasants relied on beans or whatever could be trapped in the woods, rabbits, birds, even hedgehogs. During times of plenty, meals were simple but sustaining. But in years of bad harvest, when rains destroyed the crops or frosts struck too soon, hunger turned to famine. Peasants ate whatever they could find: weeds, bark, grass. Some accounts even speak of families boiling leather or eating cats and dogs to survive. The line between life and starvation was razor thin. A single failed harvest could mean death for thousands. From dawn until dusk, the medieval peasant labored. Men plowed fields with heavy wooden plows, pulled not by horses, they were too costly, but by oxen. Their hands blistered, their backs bent. Women worked beside them. They planted, harvested, gathered firewood, hauled water, spun wool, baked bread, and after all this, they tended to children and animals. Even children were put to work as soon as they could walk. At 5 years old, they scared crows from crops. At 7, they carried water, collected dung, gathered herbs. Childhood, as we imagine it, did not exist. And this labor was not for their benefit alone. Much of it went to the Lord, taxes in grain, eggs, or labor itself. If a peasant failed to deliver, punishment was swift: fines, beatings, even imprisonment. Their time was not their own. Their work never ended. The clothes of peasants were as harsh as their lives: rough wool tunics, coarse linen shirts, simple leather shoes if they had them. Most owned only one set of clothes, patched and mended until they fell apart. In winter, cloaks of sheepskin or patched wool offered little protection against freezing winds. Many peasants went barefoot through mud and snow, their feet cracked and raw. Comfort was a luxury reserved for the few. For the peasant, every season was an enemy. Summer brought burning heat in the fields. Winter brought bitter cold that killed as surely as hunger. And then, there was the smell. In villages, waste was everywhere. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food. Refuse was tossed into the street where pigs rooted through it. Rain turned it into foul rivers of filth. Clean water was rare. Wells were often contaminated. Streams doubled as drinking water, wash water, and sewers. Bathing was infrequent. Once a week, if at all. Some historians suggest peasants might bathe, only a few times a year. Lice, fleas, and skin diseases were constant companions. Disease thrived in this environment: dysentery, typhus, smallpox. For a peasant, death was never far. And yet, in the midst of all this misery, peasants clung to faith. The village church stood at the center of life. Bells called them to Mass. Priests reminded them of heaven and hell. Religion offered meaning to suffering. If their lives were filled with pain, it was God's will. If they obeyed, endured, and served, paradise might await them after death. For the Lord, religion was also a tool of control. The church reinforced obedience, teaching peasants that their place in society was divinely ordained. To rebel was not only unlawful, it was sinful. And so the cycle of toil and misery continued, sanctified by faith, enforced by fear. Moments of relief. But even in the darkest lives, there were moments of joy. Village festivals broke the monotony of labor. Feasts on holy days brought music, dancing, and rare indulgences. Ale flowed, fires blazed, and for a moment, peasants forgot their burdens. These were not luxuries, but necessities. Small sparks of light in an otherwise harsh existence. This was the daily life of the medieval peasant. Hunger was constant. Work was relentless. Disease was inevitable. They lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, rarely seeing the world beyond their village. Their names left no mark in history. Their stories were seldom told. Yet they were the silent majority, the ones who fed the lords, built the castles, and sustained medieval society. Without them, there would have been no Middle Ages, but for them, life was not glory, it was survival. While peasants toiled in the mud, another class lived very differently. The nobility, the knights, the kings, their lives seemed gilded, but they too were bound by the harshness of the medieval world. In the next chapter, we leave the village behind and step inside the castle walls.